if the beginning of our story is not really a beginning at all? What if everything we believe about the dawn of human civilization is merely the closing sentence of a much older narrative, one whose true origin lies hidden beneath layers of soil, time, and forgotten memory? Far beyond the reach of modern skylines, beyond riverbeds that once nourished ancient powers, lies a landscape where heat and silence shimmer over empty plains. Southern Iraq, now a place of dust and stillness, once sheltered the heartbeat of the first known civilization. Beneath shifting dunes, the thoughts of a vanished people remain sealed in clay, patiently waiting for someone willing to listen. Before we step into this journey through the ancient night, take a moment to breathe. If you find comfort in stories that hover between dreams and history, allow your mind to drift. Those who feel at home in mystery are the ones who hear echoes that others no longer notice. And if you remain awake while darkness settles over your world, imagine the quiet stretching across continents, listeners scattered everywhere, united not by sight, but by silence. Once, the world itself was wrapped in that silence, before words were carved into the earth. Our path does not begin with invention, it begins with rediscovery. In the late 19th century, European archaeologists started digging near the ruins of cities such as Uruk and Eridu. As their tools cut into the ground, they unearthed clay tablets hardened by thousands of years. Thousands of them. Each bore wedge-shaped symbols pressed into wet clay more than 5 millennia earlier. These were not simple lists made by a primitive people learning mathematics. They were structured records created by a culture already immersed in architecture, astronomy, law, and myth. The makers of these tablets were known as the Sumerians, and from the moment their identity was recognized, the established timeline of human history began to tremble. According to our accepted model, civilizations grow gradually, from huts to towns, from basic symbols to written languages, from modest organization to complex society. But the Sumerians did not follow that arc. They appeared suddenly around 3500 BCE, with a complete written language, advanced cities aligned with geometric precision, and knowledge of the stars that should have taken thousands of years to acquire. They built monumental temples long before Egypt imagined a pyramid. They engineered irrigation systems that controlled water and sustained multitudes. They established legal systems that organized life. They did not stumble into civilization. They arrived fully awake. No gradual ascent explains them. There is no trail of developing cultures that slowly lead to them. Their emergence resembles a door being flung open rather than a slow climb up a staircase. This abrupt appearance remains one of history's most unsettling puzzles. How can a civilization burst into existence so refined, so complete, so capable? Progress, we are taught, crawls forward. Yet the Sumerians seem to leap. Imagine holding one of their clay tablets. It fits in your hand, small and unassuming, yet it contains a universe of meaning. The symbols on its surface form what we call cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems known to humanity. Despite its age, it does not resemble a beginning. It is already structured, already versatile, already capable of recording everything from poetry and legal codes to medical recipes and star patterns. One tablet accurately tracks the movements of Venus, an astronomical feat confirmed only by modern science. Others map planetary paths as if charting familiar territory. Their writing feels less like an invention, and more like the preservation of knowledge they already possessed. Their gods were not distant imagination. Inanna, Enki, Anu, Enlil. These figures were woven into reality itself. They shaped the world, governed forces, and influenced human destinies. Their myths align eerily with stories from cultures separated by vast oceans and ages. They spoke of a time before cities, before kings, before a great flood. They insisted that knowledge was not discovered by humans, it was bestowed, not created, given. The idea that wisdom descended from above appears in Mesopotamian texts, in Hebrew scripture, in Hindu tradition, and in stories preserved by ancient peoples of the Americas. How did isolated civilizations inherit the same memory? Myths are often dismissed as superstition, but myths may be memories softened by time. When separate cultures echo the same story, coincidence becomes unlikely. The Sumerians described a cataclysmic flood that reset the world. The Babylonians repeated the story. The Bible reshaped it. India preserved it. Greece recalled it. Even the distant Americas carried fragments of it. How could a single narrative survive such distance unless it recorded something that truly happened? Perhaps memory behaves like sediment, settling wherever humans gather. Or perhaps humanity once shared a common past before becoming scattered across the planet. When excavations began in Uruk, believed to be the first real city, archaeologists expected rudimentary structures and tentative beginnings. Instead, they discovered walls stretching for miles, buildings aligned with celestial markers, and evidence of advanced metalwork. Buried beneath one temple lay a library of more than 40,000 tablets, more written records than entire medieval kingdoms produced. But this treasure of memory carried with it an enigma. The Sumerians used a numerical system based on 60 instead of 10. From this system we inherited our hours, minutes, and the 360 degrees used to measure a circle. Why did they choose such a complex base? Why did they track Venus so carefully? Why did they embed celestial cycles into their calendar with such precision? Their mathematics was not experimental. It was exact. It does not resemble discovery. It resembles recollection. And yet no single artifact unsettles scholars more than a certain clay tablet now known as the Sumerian king list. Rather than poetry or worship, it reads like a record, unembellished, matter-of-fact, almost bureaucratic. It lists rulers, the cities they governed, and the lengths of their reigns. But the numbers are astonishing. Some kings ruled for thousands of years. Entire ages pass before a great flood interrupts the line of succession. After this deluge, lifespans shrink abruptly and align with what we now consider normal human years. The list opens with a declaration so bold it challenges our understanding of history. Kingship descended from the sky. Not discovered, not invented, descended. It begins in Eridu, the first city. Not the birthplace of innovation, but the restoration of something that came before. One inscription even asserts that what the Sumerians built was not new, but a reconstruction. In their eyes, they were not creators. They were inheritors. Their worldview suggests something profound. Humanity is not climbing toward knowledge. It is returning to it. We are not inventing civilization. We are remembering it, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, like archaeologists of our own forgotten past. Perhaps we stand not at the dawn of history but on its ruins. A single artifact in the ancient collections of the Near East carries a sentence that chills anyone who reads it with care. This is the restoration of what was before. Not creation, not innovation, restoration. The choice of word alters everything. It implies that the civilization we call the first was not the beginning, but a rebuilding effort, a conscious attempt to reassemble something that once existed and was lost. It hints at memory, not invention, at recollection rather than discovery. Some of the most striking reminders of these hands from the past are not the texts themselves, but the fingerprints fossilized on their surfaces. Pressed into still wet clay thousands of years ago, the whorls of human skin remain visible even today. Those fingers formed the characters that shaped our earliest understanding of history. The bodies that carried those hands are long gone, but the clay retains their touch. It is as if those ancient writers refused to vanish completely. Their thoughts are silent, but their presence lingers. Standing before such tablets, one can feel an unsettling sensation. That perhaps humanity is not moving upward into new realms of knowledge, but downward into what once was. We are not escalating. We are descending, excavating ideas left behind by ancestors we do not remember. Archaeology digs into the ground, but knowledge also seems to fall out of the sky, drifting downward like fragments of a shattered memory returning piece by piece. The winds that sweep across the ancient sands of Uruk carry more than dust. Every grain seems like a letter from a sentence too vast for us to understand. Yet, as we remain here, listening to the hum of forgotten ages, an uncomfortable truth begins to emerge. We do not stand at the dawn of civilization. We stand at the fading edge of something once complete. If the Sumerians were not the first, the question becomes, who taught them, and who before them taught those who came before? Of all the mysteries they left behind, none resonates with greater weight than the tablet now known as the Sumerian King List. It does not whisper mythology. It declares lineage. It reads like a chronicle that refuses to bow to the limits of our understanding. On its surface, etched with meticulous strokes, names of rulers unfold in a sequence that stretches beyond reason. These kings do not reign for decades or centuries, but for tens of thousands of years. Thousands. Numbers so large they threaten to snap our minds in disbelief. The list begins with a phrase that may be the most provocative statement in all of ancient literature. After kingship descended from the heavens, kingship was in Eridu. Here, authority does not emerge from human effort. It descends. It arrives. The first city does not invent rule. It receives it. The document continues with 8 kings who ruled for staggeringly long periods before a catastrophic flood brings their age to a close. One king reigns for 36,000 years. Another rules nearly 30,000. In total, these primordial rulers govern for more than 200,000 years. Only after the flood do reigns shrink to lengths we consider human. It is as if time itself changed, first flowing in vast epochs, then suddenly constrained to mortal boundaries. The flood becomes more than a physical event. It becomes a rupture in reality, a dividing line between worlds. Scholars have tried to untangle the logic behind these enormous numbers. Some argue they represent symbolic values, exaggerated generations, or astronomical cycles misunderstood by later readers. Others propose that the measurements refer to units of time no longer recognized, mathematical constructs encoded in Sumer's sexagesimal system. According to this system, time and space flow through multiples of 60, not 10. Under such a scale, a single unit can represent thousands of years. Yet even with this recalibration, the scale remains baffling. Regardless of interpretation, the precision of the list suggests intention, not error. But there is something deeper embedded in the list than numbers. There is longing, a sorrow, a sense that something magnificent once existed and slipped away. Each king's name feels like a tombstone marking not only a ruler, but an era, a memory, a lost state of being. The tone of the text is not boastful. It is mournful. It does not celebrate invention or progress. It remembers something gone. Multiple copies of the king list have been found across Mesopotamia, never identical, always echoing the same structure. A beginning before the flood, a severing, a new world afterward. The existence of so many versions suggests scribes struggled to preserve a recollection that was already fading. They did not invent these names. They tried desperately to save them from oblivion. The flood itself appears in the list with chilling simplicity. One sentence, no embellishment, no allegory. Then the flood swept over. No mythic flourish, no divine reasoning, just water, a natural wall dividing epochs. The Sumerians were not alone in this memory. Their neighbours held similar accounts, their successors retold it. Their stories infected other cultures, reshaping into the epics and scriptures that endure today. Beneath the city of archaeologists uncovered a thick layer of sterile clay, 2 meters deep, resting like a scar between ancient human settlements. No tools, no bones, no structures, only flood silt. Sits between older remains and younger ones, signifying a moment when something washed life away and left a blank page for the world to write upon again. Similar layers appear across other Mesopotamian sites. Whatever happened was not local. It was immense. To the Sumerians, this flood did not merely destroy, it reset existence. It silenced something ancient and allowed something lesser to rise. Before the waters came, kings reigned for ages beyond imagination. After the flood, kings lived and died like ordinary men, Something changed. Something was lost. The list ends where our accepted history begins, right at the seam where myth and archaeology touch. This seam is not clean. It frays, it questions, it asks, why did civilization begin fully formed? Why do its earlier stories carry memories of cycles, floods, and celestial descent? The builders of Eridu did not claim to rise from nothing. They believed they rebuilt something older. Each temple in this ancient city lies on top of another, layered like geological time. The deeper one digs, the more peculiar the findings become. The oldest layers appear the most advanced. Precision declines as one moves upward through time. Knowledge fades. Skill erodes. Civilization does not emerge and grow. It returns and decays. Buried artifacts at Eridu include objects carved from stone not found anywhere near the region. Materials from mountains hundreds of miles away. Shells from distant seas. How did a supposedly primitive people secure such items? The possibility of long-distance trade exists, but these objects appear at the very birth of their culture, not after centuries of development. It suggests inheritance, not acquisition. Everywhere we look, the pattern remains the same. The earliest Sumerian achievements are the most sophisticated. Instead of a culture climbing toward greatness, we find a culture trying to preserve fragments of something already great, a civilization remembering rather than inventing. And this memory is not isolated. Other ancient texts echo similar claims. Egyptian papyri speak of divine rulers who reigned before pharaohs. Hindu scriptures describe ages that lasted tens of thousands of years. Mesoamerican legends recount suns that rose and fell long before ours. Whether separated by oceans or millennia, cultures remember long ages, advanced beings, and catastrophic endings. If these stories were pure fantasy, why do they align so precisely? The Sumerians named their pre-flood kings Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, names that do not appear later, as if they belong to a reality incompatible with ours. Yet the cities associated with these rulers, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Shurupak, exist in the archaeological record. Their foundations are real. Their walls once stood. If their places existed, why not their rulers? But perhaps the most haunting sentence in the king list is not the one that begins the record, but the one that challenges everything we believe about beginnings. After the flood swept over, kingship descended from the sky again. Again. The word implies repetition, cycles, a pattern of rise and fall. If kingship descends more than once, how many times has civilization begun? How many ages have ended? Perhaps we're not building the future. Perhaps we're reconstructing the past. The Sumerians did not see themselves as pioneers. They saw themselves as custodians, guarding a fragile inheritance. They carved their stories into clay because they feared silence. They feared forgetting. They knew that civilizations do not collapse from lack of ideas, but from the loss of memory. To them, forgetting was the true death. Today we excavate their tablets and marvel at mysteries they took for granted. We struggle to interpret remnants of a world they tried not to lose. Their laments are not about ignorance. They mourn memory slipping through their fingers. The past, in their eyes, was not something behind them. It loomed ahead, like a horizon they longed to reach again. Civilization does not begin with innovation. It begins with remembering. And memory, like clay, can crumble. There is something almost sacred in the night sky, something that has watched humanity rise, fracture, and begin again. Many of us gaze upward and paint stories across its canvas. Constellations take on the forms of gods, animals, or lost heroes. Yet the people of ancient Sumer did not simply imagine stories in the heavens. They measured them. They recorded them. For them, the stars were not symbols. They were instructions. To walk through the remnants of Sumerian cities is to enter a world where the boundary between earth and sky dissolves. Their great temple towers were not mere places of worship. They functioned like observatories, rising step by step toward the cosmos. These towering ziggurats were aligned not by chance, but with precise astronomical intention. Long before telescopes or compasses existed, Before advanced mathematics had been formalized, the Sumerians mapped the movements of the heavens with an accuracy that continues to perplex modern researchers. At the ruins of Ur and Nippur, the geometry becomes unmistakable. The foundations of their buildings face cardinal direction so precisely that even today, scholars struggle to explain how such alignment was achieved without advanced tools. The great ziggurat of Ur sits almost perfectly oriented to true north, its angles and platforms arranged as though the builders possessed knowledge of celestial mechanics rather than mere superstition. It resembles a physical equation fashioned in brick and stone. Among the thousands of clay tablets found throughout Mesopotamia are detailed star charts and celestial lists. These are not tentative attempts to decipher the night sky. They are confident, authoritative. They describe the risings and settings of constellations, the timing of solstices and equinoxes, and the predictable path of Venus across the heavens. One set of texts, known by scholars today as Mul'apin, catalogues stars with such precision that astronomers still consult it. To record these observations required centuries of watching the skies. Yet the Sumerians appear suddenly with this information already in hand. How does a civilization that arrives fully formed possess astronomical knowledge that should require generations of observations? To track Venus accurately demands awareness of its complex cycle, which repeats approximately every 8 years. To understand the slow wobble of Earth's axis, known today as precession, demands observations across centuries. Yet hints of such knowledge exist in early Sumerian writings. In modern history, this concept was attributed to Greek astronomers thousands of years later. How did the Sumerians seem to know it long before it appeared elsewhere? This paradox challenges the foundations of historical understanding. If they learned these things themselves, where are the earlier, less accurate records? Where are the crude diagrams, the trial and error experiments, the mistakes that precede mastery? There are none. The earliest Sumerian records are already correct, already refined, already confident. It is as though they were not discovering knowledge but recovering it. Even their mythology mirrors astronomical events. The goddess Inanna, associated with Venus, disappears into the underworld and returns, mirroring the planets vanishing from Earth's view and reappearance in the dawn sky. The moon god Nanna governs tides, calendars, and timekeeping. Their deities are not vague spiritual forces, but celestial patterns woven into narrative. Their myths read like coded scientific texts, stories that are also measurements. To the Sumerians, the cosmos was not a random sprawl of stars. It was a structured system. Observing it was not an act of wonder, but a duty. Their temples were not simply places of sacrifice, but were instruments through which priests tracked the rhythm of the universe. Mathematics, ritual, astronomy, and architecture were not separate disciplines. They formed a single language. Even more astonishing is their numbering system. While nearly every other culture eventually adopted a base 10 system, the Sumerians anchored their mathematics in the number 60. They divided hours into 60 minutes, and minutes into 60 seconds. They carved circles into 360 degrees. We still use their choices today. Every time a clock ticks, every time a navigator measures a course, every time a mathematician works with angles, we echo decisions made thousands of years ago. Why would a supposedly primitive culture construct a system more efficient and versatile than our own? Some historians suggest necessity drove their genius. Others sense something deeper, that the Sumerians inherited rather than invented their framework. Their own writings support this idea. They claimed that knowledge was not created but restored. Their gods did not teach them how to think. They reminded them of knowledge that already existed. Adding to the mystery are artifacts that do not belong in their time. Among Mesopotamian ruins, archaeologists have uncovered beautifully crafted lenses made of rock crystal. Officially, these are described as decorative, yet their curvature suggests magnifying properties. Why would a culture without optics carve lenses that behave like rudimentary instruments? Then there is the enigmatic concept they called the me. Modern translations struggle to contain its meaning. It is not simply law, nor power, nor knowledge. It is something like the operating principles of existence, codes that define how the world functions. The me dictate kingship, language, music, architecture, warfare, and even the weaving of cloth. In myth, the goddess Inanna steals these from the god Enki, causing chaos until she returns them. Without the me, civilization collapses. With them, order returns instantly. This reads less like myth, and more like a description of lost technologies, knowledge modules that could be transferred, lost, or corrupted. When viewed through modern understanding, these me resemble instructions or programs, blueprints that activate capabilities. They are not ideas, they are permissions. Whoever possesses them governs reality. Taken together, these clues form a portrait of a people who did not believe they were inventing civilization. They believed they were safeguarding fragments of something older. Their writing, architecture, and astronomy were attempts to remember, not to create. The Sumerians were less like pioneers and more like archivists, racing against the erosion of memory. Something had happened before them, something immense, something catastrophic enough to shatter a world and leave only shards of knowledge behind. Their culture was not a beginning, it was a reconstruction. Which raises the most important question of all. If Sumer was rebuilding, what was lost? Perhaps we are not the pinnacle of history. Perhaps we are not the first civilization to look upward and measure the stars. Perhaps we walk inside a cycle so ancient we have forgotten it exists. The Sumerians left no boast in their wake. They left warnings. Civilization survives only so long as memory does, and memory, once fractured, does not vanish instantly. It fades, piece by piece, until all that remains are ruins, tablets, and silent watchers in the night sky. Hidden beneath the fractured ruins of ancient Sumer lies something even more astonishing than their temples or tablets, evidence suggesting that the Sumerians possessed practical knowledge they should not have had at the dawn of human civilization. Their writings do not merely speak of gods and legends. They contain instructions, formulas, techniques, and architectural rules that seem to rise suddenly out of nowhere, without an earlier developmental stage. It is as though the Sumerians inherited fragments of a science older than themselves, remnants from an age erased by time. When excavations at places like Eridu, Kish, and Uruk began, researchers expected rudimentary foundations, crude shelters, simple tools, and early attempts at organization. Instead, they uncovered plans, not rough sketches, not primitive models, but precise measurements and ratios, as though someone already understood geometry and construction long before such knowledge should have existed. Ziggurats were not trial structures. They were engineered with deliberate inclines, exact orientations, and standardized materials. Their builders did not slowly learn how to create monumental architecture. They entered history already knowing how. This pattern suggests something profound. The earlier Sumerians were not experimenting. They were remembering. Even their language reflects this idea. Central to their worldview is the mysterious term me, often translated merely as laws or attributes. But the word carries a meaning far more potent. The me are not commandments. They are the underlying mechanisms of reality, principles that cause civilization to function. They govern everything from the way cities are built to how humans behave, how music is composed, how rulers rule, and how societies sustain themselves. When myths describe the goddess Inanna stealing the me from Enki, the story is not about theft. It describes the transfer of essential knowledge. When these principles are removed, the world destabilizes, not metaphorically but structurally. This interpretation casts the Sumerians not as creators of systems, but as custodians. They did not believe they discovered anything. They insisted they received it. The evidence in their ruins supports this. At Nippur, archaeologists found a massive library dating back to the earlier stages of Sumerian culture. Within it were thousands of tablets filled with information, star movements, administrative records, medical instructions, legal codes, hymns, rituals, and mathematical operations. But what makes this archive remarkable is not the breadth of subjects. It is the lack of developmental stages. The knowledge appears fully formed. There are no primitive versions of mathematical concepts, no early drafts of medical texts, no mistakes. Everything appears refined, as if copied from something older. Medicinal tablets, for example, do not describe plants in terms of appearance. They categorize them by effect, a system implying countless years of experimentation. Recipes instruct how to combine sulfur, oils, and copper to create compounds used for purification. These are not the hesitant guesses of a society at the edge of understanding. They are precise formulas passed down intact. In Kish, researchers found metal objects far harder than expected for the time, suggesting an advanced understanding of alloy production that should not exist at the dawn of metallurgy. Drill holes carved into diorite, a stone so hard modern tools struggle to shape it, hint at methods beyond the presumed capabilities of the era. These findings echo the same unsettling theme. The earlier Sumerians appear more advanced than those who came later. This reversal contradicts everything taught about human progress. Civilizations are expected to evolve upward, gaining complexity generation by generation. But the deeper archaeologists dig, the more sophisticated the findings become. Instead of a slow rise, there is a clear decline. Mastery gives way to imitation. Precision devolves into approximation. This pattern is not unique to Sumer. Similar anomalies appear wherever ancient civilizations begin. The earliest Egyptian temples display techniques later builders could not replicate. The Indus Valley's earlier cities show urban planning more advanced than those that followed. It is as though the first civilizations did not begin from nothing. They began from memory. The Sumerians themselves admitted this. Their myths do not celebrate discovery. They mourn loss. In their stories, gods do not create humanity to explore or innovate. Humans are made to labor, to preserve order, to maintain what already exists. Creation, in their worldview, is not the beginning of knowledge. It is its recovery. This theme appears in the myth of Inanna and the Me, where the goddess retrieves the foundational codes of civilization from Enki. The world does not grow chaotic until these principles are removed. When they are restored, order reappears instantly. If ideas must be restored to recreate civilization, then something must have existed before, and everywhere in their culture this sense of recovery persists. Their calendars, their laws, their music, their measurements, none begin as primitive forms. All appear ready, complete, as though copied from a forgotten design. Other ancient cultures echo similar sentiments. Religious texts from distant lands speak not of a world being invented, but of one being rebuilt. Their gods hold knowledge they fear losing. Their heroes recover lost wisdom rather than create new discoveries. The tone is not pride, but anxiety. Something was known once, something was lost. Those who came after could only salvage fragments. The Sumerians appear hyper-aware of this fragility. Their tablets are filled not with claims of greatness, but with warnings. They feared not weapons or enemies, but silence. Forgetting terrified them. To write was not simply to communicate, it was to resist oblivion. Their scribes were not authors. They were guardians standing between memory and darkness. In the libraries of later civilizations such as Nineveh, scribes copied older Sumerian writings with notes that read like laments, copied from a damaged tablet. What remained, I have written, restored from the original. These are not the voices of innovators. They are the voices of witnesses, desperate to preserve what little they had left. Their texts suggest a worldview unlike ours. We believe knowledge builds. They believed knowledge erodes. We imagine humanity climbing a ladder. They felt themselves slipping down one. Perhaps in their eyes, civilization was not something to invent. It was something to remember before it vanished again. Their temples, tablets, and myths carry the same quiet tragedy. The awareness that the world has collapsed before, and will collapse again. That memory fades, that progress is temporary, that only what is carved into something enduring can survive the flood of forgetfulness. When we view Sumer through this lens, its mysteries stop being anomalies and become symptoms. We are not witnessing the birth of civilization, we are witnessing its aftermath. And what remains unspoken, yet impossible to ignore, is this. If the Sumerians were rebuilding from ruins, where are the ruins of the world they remembered? Clay does not breathe, yet it carries voices across millennia. In the shattered remains of Sumerian cities, beneath layers of dust and conquest, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary, not weapons or treasures, but tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, each tablet pressed with wedge-shaped marks that look simple from afar, yet contain an entire civilization's heartbeat. These were not mere records, they were anchors, attempts to hold memory still before it slipped into the abyss. Nippur, one of the most ancient and sacred of Sumerian cities, was not a seat of kings, nor a fortress of armies. It was something far more potent, a sanctuary of memory. There scribes curated tablets like sacred seeds, preserving recipes, laws, hymns, astronomical knowledge, and medical practices. They catalogued proverbs, star charts, diagnoses, tax records, myths, and philosophical reflections. The air of those ancient rooms must have been heavy with dust and reverence, alive with the scratch of styluses pressing thoughts into clay. Writing, for the Sumerians, was not an invention of convenience. It was a shield against oblivion. Their word for writing meant to make the voice lasting. Each tablet thus became a vessel of immortality, capturing fragments of a world that was slipping away. To write incorrectly was not a small mistake. It was a fracture in reality, an act of disorder that could unravel what remained. Ironically, many tablets survived through destruction. When fires raged, when cities fell, the heat baked clay into stone. What was meant to be a temporary medium became indestructible. Palaces burned, and libraries turned eternal. Ashes preserved memory better than tombs ever could. In the mid-19th century, when excavations unearthed the vast library of Nineveh, scholars stood stunned. Tens of thousands of tablets filled room after room. But the greatest surprise was not their quantity. It was their age. These were not contemporary documents. They were copies of far older texts from Sumer and Babylon, curated like relics that must not die. King Ashurbanipal, whose name is etched into history, did not commission new knowledge. He rescued old knowledge. He preserved what he feared the world might forget. Some tablets contain haunting marginal notes, small sentences that open a window into the minds of their scribes. The original tablet was damaged. I have written, what remained? What was missing? I could not restore. These are not triumphal proclamations. They are confessions of loss. They carry the tone of survivors, not inventors. People who lived in the afterglow of something greater and feared the darkness closing in. In that same library were fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest hero's tale on Earth. Its story includes a flood narrative that predated the biblical account. It tells of a chosen man who builds a vessel to survive a deluge, a vessel that preserves life while chaos reigns outside. This myth appears not as fantasy, but as the memory of something too large to forget, retold across civilizations because it was once real. Hidden among these ancient texts are no explanations for the knowledge they contain. They assume the reader already understands the universe. They do not define planets or constellations. They merely list them. They do not outline the logic behind their laws. They present them as immutable facts. Their medical instructions do not ponder whether herbs might heal. They state precise combinations and effects. Everything is presented with certainty. This certainty raises a question. Why does the oldest writing on Earth read like reference material rather than discovery? It is because the Sumerians did not see themselves as creators. They saw themselves as archivists. Their job was not to craft new truths, but to make sure the old ones did not vanish. They believed the world had already reached its height, and they clung to what they could salvage. Some tablets reveal a level of anatomical knowledge that should not exist at such an early time. They detail the shapes and functions of organs. They classify plants by their effects, not appearance. They prescribe treatments with precision modern doctors find startling. How many generations would be required to reach such understanding from scratch? Yet here it is, already complete. Their mathematical texts are equally perplexing. Some contain tables that predate well-known mathematical discoveries by millennia. Problems solved with what we now call the Pythagorean theorem appear 1,000 years before Pythagoras was ever born. How can something be discovered before the person credited with discovering it lived? Even their myths contain technical knowledge. Inanna's descent into the underworld reflects the invisible periods of Venus, disappearing and reappearing in the sky. Rituals reflect lunar cycles. Hymns mirror harmonic ratios. Their stories were not mere entertainment. They were algorithms, poetic structures layered over scientific truth. To the Sumerians, myth was not fiction. Myth was a coded system of memory. And yet, something happened. At some point, the memory fractured. Gaps appeared. Traditions eroded. The clarity of knowledge faded, leaving only the outlines. What once was understood became symbolic. What once was fact became belief. What once guided survival became ritual. Their scribes sensed this fading. Their laments speak not of hunger or danger, but of knowledge slipping beyond reach. They feared a future where no one remembered the me, the laws that shaped existence. They feared a world that would forget how to build, how to heal, how to calculate, how to read the sky. They feared a civilization that would survive physically but die intellectually. Civilization to them was not stone or brick, it was memory. This is why the Sumerians carved their world into clay. They knew a truth we refuse to face. A world that forgets itself must begin again. Their kingdom fell, their people died, and their language sank beneath the sands. But the tablets endured. Locked inside them is a message we are only beginning to understand. History does not start with invention. It starts with remembering. And when memory dies, history resets. The Sumerians left their words not as guides for their time, but as warnings for ours. From the very beginning of human storytelling, there exists a moment that unsettles even modern minds, a point where humanity becomes aware of itself. In the Sumerian worldview, this awakening did not arise through gradual evolution or slow learning. It was deliberate, intentional, crafted with purpose. Their oldest accounts do not portray humans as creatures slowly emerging from wilderness. They present humanity as something shaped, formed, assembled, as though existence was the result of a designed process rather than a spontaneous event. At a glance, these narratives appear mythological, populated by gods and symbols, yet the closer one reads them, the more they resemble memory disguised in metaphor. They describe not an instantaneous miracle, but a sequence of attempts, revisions, and improvements until a final workable being emerged, one capable of labor, understanding, and devotion. This idea is crystallized in the story of Enki and Ninhursag, where the gods, burdened with maintaining the world, decide they can no longer endure the toil alone. Their power did not free them from work. They still needed to irrigate the land, maintain order, and shape existence. So they convened like a council deciding on a solution to an overwhelming problem. Instead of philosophical abstraction, their myth unfolds like a workshop. The gods needed workers, beings who could obey commands, carry burdens, and preserve balance. They attempted to mold these beings from the clay of the earth, but clay alone lacked something essential. The first creations were flawed. Some could not speak, others could not reproduce, others lacked strength. These failures continued until the gods added something else, something that changed everything. A divine spark, a bloodline, an essence. In the Atrahasis account, the blood of a god is mixed with clay, and from this union humans are born. It is a line that modern readers interpret metaphorically. Yet what is blood if not a carrier of genetic information? What is clay if not the earth from which our bodies are composed? Stripped of poetry, the story reads like an encoded description of a transformative process, one that blends the material and the immaterial to create a new kind of being. This theme does not belong solely to Sumer. Egyptian texts speak of people formed from the tears of Ra. Hebrew tradition recalls breath infused into dust. Greek mythology remembers Prometheus molding humans from clay. To treat all of these as coincidence requires more faith than to consider the possibility of shared memory. The Sumerians did not believe humans emerged by chance. They believed humanity was made for a purpose, constructed by beings who required help to manage a world they could not maintain alone. Humans were not gifted free existence. They were assigned roles. Early humans served, and only later did they begin to question. The concept of the me reinforces this resolve. The me were not simply laws or symbols. They were essential operating principles, the very foundation of civilization. Each me represented a function without which society could not exist. Writing, kingship, craftsmanship, agriculture, sexuality, war, architecture, music, and countless others. They did not emerge through experimentation. They were distributed, allocated like permissions. When Inanna stole the me from Enki and brought them to her city, Uruk did not invent civilization, it received it. In myth, once the Emi were present, civilization existed fully formed, without transition or learning curve. This supports the notion that the Sumerians saw themselves not as inventors of culture, but as custodians of something pre-existing, something retrieved rather than discovered. Their creation tales portray humans as hybrids, beings carrying divine essence and earthly substance. They are neither gods nor animals. They occupy a space between, capable of thought, emotion, obedience, rebellion, and memory. Yet humans in these stories soon exceed their purpose. They work, but they also dream. They grow in number, they create noise, they unsettle the gods who designed them. The same myths that celebrate creation ultimately describe the gods' regret. In the Atrahasis narrative, humanity becomes too numerous, too loud, too independent. The gods, once exhausted by labor, now find themselves exhausted by the very beings who are meant to relieve them. Their solution is drastic. They attempt to reduce humanity through disease, famine, and finally a great flood meant to wipe the slate clean. This is not punishment for sin, but an attempt to silence a world that has exceeded its function. Yet even here, one god resists. Enki, who helped shape humanity, intervenes. He speaks through a reed wall circumventing divine law to warn a man, Atrahasis, of the coming catastrophe. He gives instructions, not reassurance. He provides measurements for a structure that is not described as a ship meant to sail, but as a chamber sealed against the world's destruction. Its purpose is endurance, not travel. When the waters finally recede, Atrahasis emerges into a world altered forever. The gods regret their decision, realizing that without humans they lack offerings, order and structure. They require the very beings they tried to erase. The cycle of dependency resumes, but on different terms. This idea that humans were made, controlled, then nearly erased, echoes in countless cultures. The Hindu scriptures speak of ages destroyed and renewed. The Maya recall eras ended by water and fire. The Greeks describe resets and cosmic battles. Even the biblical narrative retains the memory of a chosen man preserved through flood. These parallels do not diminish the Sumerian story. They strengthen it. They reveal a recurring pattern, a shared inheritance of memory scattered across continents and languages. If myth preserves memory, then the Sumerian account suggests that the gods were not eternal beings, but participants in a history that predates humans. They were not omniscient creators, but administrators, stewards of knowledge they themselves inherited. Some Sumerian texts hint that even gods could die, their bloodline persisting through humanity. This transforms divinity into ancestry. It reframes gods not as beings beyond comprehension, but as remnants of a prior age. Such an idea changes the nature of myth. It turns religious stories into encoded records of events. It implies that humanity is not the first iteration of intelligent life on this planet. It hints at cycles, worlds built, worlds destroyed, worlds rebuilt with fragments of what came before. If humanity holds divine essence, the implication is not that humans worship gods, but that humans descend from something once revered, something that fell or fled or disappeared, leaving instructions behind. Perhaps this is why the Sumerians feared forgetting more than death. To forget was to lose the blueprint, the me, the code that sustains existence. Their tablets are not odes to triumph, but warnings carved into permanence. They suggest that if memory disappears, the world must begin again, ignorant of the heights it once reached. Modern perspectives dismiss these notions as myth, yet the myths persist. They outlast civilizations, governments, languages, and borders. They survive fires, floods, and time. Why? Because memory does not care for belief. It only requires survival. The Sumerian story does not say humanity was born ignorant. It says humanity began with knowledge it did not understand. It says we were shaped, guided, and then abandoned to rebuild from fragments. It says we're not climbing toward greatness. We are wandering back toward it, searching through ruins of our own forgotten past. If that is true, our history is not a straight line. It is a circle. Civilizations are not new worlds. They are returns. Every rise is a remembering. Every collapse is a forgetting. And every flood is a reset. Humans have always gazed upward, searching for answers in the stars, but the Sumerians did not merely look for meaning. They believed the heavens dictated reality. Their gods were not abstract beings floating beyond mortal reach. They were rulers of celestial domains, each associated with a specific star, planet, or cosmic function. To understand the divine was to understand the sky. Their temples rose like mountains crafted by human hands, layered steps echoing the tears of the cosmos. Each ziggurat was a meeting place between heaven and earth, a point where cosmic authority filtered into the human world. To them, the world was not separated into the physical and the spiritual. It was a single, unified system in which stars governed seasons, gods governed fates, and kings governed people, each reflecting the other. This worldview explains why kingship, in their records, does not emerge from human ambition. It descends, bestowed from above like a mantle of cosmic legitimacy. A king in Sumer was not a ruler because he desired power. He ruled because the universe required structure. Kingship was not political. It was metaphysical. It ensured order by mirroring the heavens on earth. This belief imbued governance with a weight that remains difficult for modern minds to grasp. To break law was to break cosmic harmony. To challenge a king was to rebel against the order of the universe itself. Among their rulers, one figure stands apart, a man whose fame survived for thousands of years after the clay tablets that bore his name turned to dust. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, was no ordinary monarch. His story is humanity's oldest surviving epic, a tale carved into stone long before Homer sang of Achilles or Odysseus. To the Sumerians, Gilgamesh was not merely a hero. He was a being straddling two worlds, 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal, born of gods but destined to die. His existence reflected the Sumerian understanding of humanity itself, caught between immortality and decay, knowledge and ignorance, memory and oblivion. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins not with victory, but with restlessness. Gilgamesh possesses fame, wealth, and power, yet feels an emptiness no conquest can fill. He searches for meaning, for immortality, for an answer to the question that haunts every human heart: why must we die? To challenge fate, he embarks on a journey through forests, across mountains, and into realms beyond nature, driven by a hunger for something he cannot name. His trials resemble humanity's own, striving for permanence in a world built on impermanence. Gilgamesh's transformation begins with the arrival of Enkidu, a wild man shaped from clay and blessed by the gods to counterbalance the king's unchecked strength. Enkidu is untamed, yet pure. He lives among animals, free from cities and laws, unaware of writing, kingship, or cosmic duty. When he enters Uruk, his innocence dissolves. Civilization grants him knowledge, but also sorrow. Enkidu's journey from nature to society mirrors the Sumerian belief that humanity did not evolve into consciousness. Consciousness was imposed upon it. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu becomes the axis of the epic. Through Enkidu, the king discovers companionship, humility, and vulnerability. Only after Enkidu's death does Gilgamesh confront the truth that terrifies all who live: mortality. His grief becomes a catalyst. He abandons his throne and wanders the world, desperate to escape death, seeking Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood and was granted eternal life. It is Utnapishtim who reveals the cosmic divide. Immortality was once attainable, but the world has changed. The flood shattered the former order. What was possible before cannot be reclaimed. Humanity, once closer to godhood, has fallen into a lesser age. This revelation aligns perfectly with the Sumerian worldview that history does not progress, it diminishes. The world is not growing wiser, it is forgetting. Gilgamesh returns home not with eternal life, but with awareness. His legacy becomes the city he builds, the walls he lays, the story he leaves behind. Immortality, he learns, is not the preservation of the body. It is the endurance of the name. Civilization becomes the vessel through which memory resists the darkness. If Gilgamesh embodies the quest for meaning, Utnapishtim embodies something far more unsettling, the memory of a world erased. His story reveals details of the Great Flood, a catastrophe so vast it rebooted civilization. Through him, we glimpse the fracture between the age of gods and the age of men. Civilization before the flood was not merely different, it was superior. After the deluge, humanity was diminished, constrained, cut off from knowledge once freely given. The flood did not simply destroy cities, it severed memory. Across Sumerian literature, this theme appears relentlessly. Whether in epic tales, religious hymns, or administrative records, the implication remains the same. The world we inhabit is a fragment of an older whole. We are not rising toward greatness. We are stumbling back toward fragments of something once fully understood. The Sumerians did not see themselves as the first people. They saw themselves as survivors, inheritors of a broken legacy. When their civilization finally fell, it did so not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow exhaling, a dimming of memory. Their language disappeared, their gods faded, their cities crumbled, yet fragments of their stories endured. Later cultures absorbed their myths, retold their epics, borrowed their gods, translated their laws, and kept their numbers ticking in our clocks and compasses. Today, without knowing it, we speak pieces of their world every time we measure time, every time we divide a circle, every time we question where we came from. Sumer may be gone, but it refuses to vanish. It persists like a ghost, silent yet present, forgotten yet foundational. Their civilization may lie buried, but their message rises. Nothing begins. Everything returns. We inherit more than we create. We remember more than we learn. And somewhere beneath the layers of our own history, perhaps we too are fragments of a world lost, long before our first word was spoken. Cities are not born by accident. They rise where ideas converge, where memory anchors itself in stone, and where people gather not only to survive, but to become something more. Among all ancient cities, none looms larger in the shadow of history than Uruk. Its walls, once stretching across the horizon, whispered of a world that understood itself far better than we do today. Uruk did not grow slowly from a cluster of huts. It appeared structured, deliberate, as if poured into existence from a mould. Its streets, temples, and administrative centres were not experiments. They were the architecture of certainty. To step into ancient Uruk would have been to enter a world already complete. This city had bureaucracy, priests, rulers, music, trade routes, and laws. It possessed writing so refined that, even in its earliest form, it could record everything from taxes to hymns. The tablets found in its ruins reveal a society not struggling to organize itself, but one that seemed to be reactivating a complex system already known. Cities usually reflect a ladder of progress, each generation building upon the last, yet Uruk's foundation looks nothing like a beginning. It resembles a continuation. The rhythm of life there revolved around a temple economy. Priests and scribes tracked harvests, offerings, labor, and trade using tokens and clay tablets. They did not merely count grain. They understood logistics, how to move resources through time and space. They were not learning how to manage society. They were preserving an operation that already worked. Writing did not evolve from scratches of curiosity. It entered history mature, capable of managing an entire civilization from its inception. Later cultures would refine writing styles, scripts, and artistic flourishes, but the conceptual leap, the moment when humanity transformed thought into symbols, does not appear in fragments. It appears suddenly, as if memory, not imagination, birthed it. The authority of Uruk flowed not from charisma or conquest, but from the perception that its order reflected cosmic order. Even kings, who held immense earthly power, were primarily guardians of balance rather than rulers of men. Their crowns were not symbols of ego. They were reminders of responsibility. A king was expected to maintain the link between heaven and earth by upholding the me, the foundational principles of existence. If he failed, reality itself could fracture. The prosperity of Uruk was a manifestation of these principles. Its granaries overflowed, its temples gleamed, its culture expanded so rapidly that for a moment it seemed the city would define eternity. But prosperity has a shadow. Where memory is preserved, it can also become distorted. As Uruk grew, so too did ambition. Kingship became more than stewardship. It became desire. This shift appears subtly in later texts. The balance between gods and humans, between cosmic duty and earthly power, shows strain. Where early myths describe the harmonious exchange of knowledge, later stories reveal tension, disobedience, and conflict. Humanity begins to challenge its limits. Kings seek immortality. Priests safeguard secrets. The divine becomes more distant. The human becomes restless. This change did not occur overnight. It unfolded like a long exhale, a fading of clarity. The knowledge that once flowed freely became ritualized. Techniques that once served as practical instructions turned symbolic. Words preserved form, but lost meaning. The me were still recited, but fewer understood what they governed. Civilization continued to function, but it no longer remembered why it functioned. Like a machine left running without an operator, the world moved automatically, unaware of its original purpose. This process, subtle yet inevitable, reached beyond Sumer. Babylon rose and inherited fragments of the old order. Assyria preserved libraries of ancient texts without knowing their origins. Persia borrowed gods it no longer understood. Each civilization looked backward to something greater than itself, sensing a lost age rather than anticipating a future one. The echoes became fainter with each generation. The languages changed, the symbols eroded, the meanings drifted. The cycle of forgetting tightened like a noose around memory. The tablets, still legible, transformed into puzzles. Their messages survived, but the minds that once shaped them had long vanished. By the time Alexander's armies gazed upon Mesopotamia, the land that birthed civilization looked like a desert of ruins. Temples crumbled, canals dried. Once great cities became mounds of sand and silence. Uruk, the city of kings, disappeared not with a dramatic collapse but with a whisper. It slipped beneath the earth, covered by centuries of dust, waiting for the world to remember it once existed. Its walls broke, its temples cracked, its scribes vanished. Yet its influence endured in ways invisible to the eye. The very structure of time, hours, minutes, seconds, remains a shadow of Uruk. Our reasoning, our laws, our architecture, the way we divide space, these are echoes of minds who believed they were rebuilding something older still. History often portrays the ancient world as simple, but this simplicity is a mirage caused by ignorance. The further we dig, the more complex the past becomes. Each discovery suggests not a beginning, but a continuation of something we do not yet understand. Every unearthed tablet is not a child of human progress. It is a shard of memory reminding us that civilization is not linear. We do not climb toward enlightenment. We circle around fragments of a forgotten whole. Uruk reminds us of this truth. It was not the first spark. It was a flicker of something older, a reconstruction, a memory wearing the mask of a beginning. And when the light of Uruk faded, the world entered a quieter age. Not wiser, not stronger, but further removed from what it once knew. Civilizations die, but the structures they inherit persist like fossils of thought. What we call history may be nothing more than humanity's ongoing attempt to reassemble a puzzle it once held entirely. The image is broken. The pieces lie scattered across time. Each discovery tempts us to believe we are nearing completion, yet every answer births another question, and the original picture remains elusive. Perhaps we have mistaken ruins for origins. Perhaps we are not pioneers, but children playing with remnants of a forgotten world. And perhaps the Sumerians were not the first to remember. They were simply the last to know. Civilization, despite its monuments and triumphs, is fragile. It is not stone that preserves a people, nor armies, nor kings. It is memory. When memory falters, everything built upon it begins to decay. The Sumerians seemed to understand this better than any culture that came after them. They carved their warnings into clay, knowing clay could survive fire, conquest, and time. Their cities may have fallen, their gods may have quieted, but their recorded thoughts endured. Yet what they preserved was not a beginning. It was the echo of something older. By the time later civilizations looked back upon Sumer, confusion had already set in. Babylonian scholars copied tablets without fully grasping what they meant. Assyrian kings gathered ancient texts like trophies, trying to possess knowledge they no longer understood. Egyptians borrowed symbols and gods, but their meaning shifted. Each culture clung to fragments, unaware they were holding remnants of a larger forgotten whole. The cycle continued, each inheritance more distorted than the last, until only the shell of the original ideas remained. The content eroded, but the structure persisted. Empty temples, rituals repeated without comprehension, stories recited with no memory of their purpose. Language itself carried scars of this forgetting. Words that once had precise meanings became broad and vague. Concepts that once described intricate processes turned into metaphors. The further humanity moved from Sumer, the more it resembled a child playing with tools it could not operate. The world still functioned, but no one remembered why. Scholars today often treat the ancient world as primitive, imagining early civilizations stumbling through ignorance, inventing ideas through trial and error. Yet the more we uncover, the more this assumption dissolves. The earliest records are not crude, they're complex. They contain astronomy that should have required centuries of observation, mathematics that appear out of sequence, and mythology that reads like encoded history. We see no upward climb, we see a downward slope. We see knowledge inherited and then diluted. This inversion shakes the foundation of our understanding. If the first civilizations already possessed advanced knowledge, then what came before them must have been even greater. But where is the evidence of such a world? Perhaps it lies beneath oceans, buried under sediments left by ancient floods. Perhaps it exists in fragments we have not yet recognized. Or perhaps it lingers not in objects, but in stories. Stories dismissed as myth because we no longer understand their language. The Sumerians spoke openly of a time before the flood, a world ruled by beings whose lifespans stretched across ages. They saw the deluge not as symbolic cleansing, but as a rupture, a severing of one reality from another. After the waters receded, the survivors rebuilt, preserving what little remained. They believed their civilization was not the first attempt, but the latest in a long line of cycles. Creation to them was not a singular event. It was a repeated effort to restore something lost. This idea is unsettling, not because it is fantastical, but because it implies humanity is not progressing. It suggests we are wandering through ruins, mistaking broken pillars for foundations. Our theories of linear development crumble under the weight of Sumer's existence. If writing, law, mathematics, and astronomy appear fully formed at the beginning of recorded history, then our timeline is incomplete. Something is missing. We like to imagine ourselves at the peak of human achievement, yet the further back we look, the more we encounter traces of sophistication we cannot explain. Civilizations before us understood concepts we rediscovered only recently. They built structures whose purpose we cannot decipher. They spoke of cosmic cycles we only now identify in physics and astronomy. We, who believe we are advancing, may instead be relearning. The Sumerians lived with the awareness that knowledge decays. They treated memory not as luxury but as survival. Their scribes did not claim authorship. They claimed stewardship. To write something down was an act of defiance against oblivion. Every tablet was a barricade against the dark. They did not know whether the future would understand them, but they wrote anyway, hoping someone someday would remember. Their legacy raises a haunting possibility. What we call civilization may not be a mountain we are climbing, but a valley we have descended into. We may not be inventing knowledge. We may be piecing together fragments of something we once possessed entirely. Our so-called advances may be rediscoveries of principles humans once knew instinctively. If that is true, then the Sumerians were not ancient pioneers. They were the custodians of a memory older than history. Their civilization flickered, regained some strength, then dimmed, leaving behind clues we barely comprehend. And now we stand, thousands of years later, believing we are rising, while perhaps we are only recovering. One day, future archaeologists may dig through the ruins of our cities. They might find computers, satellites, books, and networks, and wonder how such sophistication appeared without a clear origin. They may ask the same question we ask of Sumer. Who taught them? Where did this knowledge come from? Why does it appear so suddenly? And if they find only fragments, they may assume we were the beginning, just as we assumed of those before us. The truth the Sumerians left behind is not comfortable. It tells us that civilizations do not climb. They cycle. They burn brightly, then fade, leaving sparks that ignite the next. Each thinks itself the first flame, unaware of the fires that came before. The greatest danger is not destruction, it is forgetting. For once memory goes, the world must begin again, blind, confident, and doomed to repeat its past. Sumer did not try to prevent the future, it tried to warn it. Their clay tablets whisper across time, telling us that we are not the first to build nor the first to fall. The question is not whether civilization will endure, it is whether memory will. Because memory is not the past. Memory is the blueprint of tomorrow. Time is a strange companion. It walks beside humanity in silence, observing us as we carve our lives into the world, yet never offering explanations. Civilizations rise, bask briefly in glory, and then fade into obscurity, leaving only the faintest signatures behind: broken walls, orphaned symbols, forgotten gods. Each generation assumes itself to be the pinnacle of progress, never considering that it might merely be living amid the ruins of something far older. The Sumerians sensed this. Their myths do not indulge in the pride of beginnings. They whisper of cycles, worlds built, destroyed, and rebuilt again, always at the mercy of memory's fragile thread. If we could stand among them, if we could walk down the avenues of hear the chants echoing through temple courtyards, or listen to scribes pressing their styluses into wet clay, perhaps we would feel that same hush, that same awareness that life was not newly forged but inherited. Every stone, every measure, every ritual seemed to affirm that existence was not a blank slate, but a restoration, an attempt to resurrect a vision whose original form had been lost to catastrophe. It is easy for us today to dismiss such ideas as mythology, but mythology is memory with metaphors draped over it. Strip away the symbols and what remains? The Sumerians believed that humanity was created to maintain order, not to discover it. They were not explorers charting unknown territory, they were caretakers of a system already in place. When one reads their text closely, there is an unsettling familiarity to their worldview, an awareness that their own greatness was not self-made. Knowledge, in their minds, preceded them. They viewed themselves as apprentices of an ancient mastery, not pioneers of a new one. And this raises a profound question. What kind of world must have existed before theirs to leave such a legacy behind? The remnants of this forgotten predecessor appear not only in stories but in the language of numbers, angles, cycles, and astronomical alignments. Every culture that inherited Sumerian systems kept the structure but lost the context, like someone who remembers a melody but not its lyrics. Our own reliance on 60, the backbone of timekeeping, comes directly from that world. We divide circles into 360 degrees, not because it is intuitive, but because someone before us understood a pattern we no longer comprehend. How did they know? Why did they choose these values? The truth dissolves the moment we ask. Imagine a civilization so acquainted with cycles of time that it considered ages, not years, as its basic unit of measurement. Imagine a culture where stars were not distant balls of gas, but coordinates, markers in a cosmic architecture whose purpose extended beyond the Earth. To such a people, The universe would not be a mystery. It would be a map. And to lose that map would be to wander forever, mistaking fragments of knowledge for discoveries. If fragments are all we have, then how much of human history is guesswork? How much of our progress is merely recovery? The more we look backward, the more we uncover systems with no apparent origin. The wheel, writing, agriculture, arithmetic. None of these evolve gently into being. They appear abruptly, fully formed, as if lifted from the debris of a fallen epoch. Consider the myth of the Anunnaki, beings described not as ethereal spirits, but as figures who interacted directly with humanity. They are said to have brought kingship, knowledge, and structure. Later generations transformed them into gods, but what were they originally? Teachers, survivors, remnants of a race destroyed by the very flood Sumerian texts describe. They were not creators, according to the texts. They were restorers, the me, those strange conceptual forces that governed every facet of existence, belonged to them before they were reluctantly handed to humanity. If the gods in these tales represent beings of flesh and breath, beings who lived, acted, and sometimes failed, then we are not reading fiction. We are reading biography. We are reading the memory of a species that disappeared. And if the Sumerians mourned what came before them, what does that say about us? We have built a world of screens and circuits, satellites and skyscrapers, convinced that we are the apex of intelligence. But intelligence without memory is repetition disguised as innovation. We congratulate ourselves for rediscovering principles encoded in ancient stone, unaware that these discoveries are echoes of lost knowledge. Our greatest scientific breakthroughs mirror truths known in antiquity, only now finally rearticulated. Quantum mechanics whispers of interconnectedness. Sumerian priests spoke of invisible forces binding heaven and earth. Astronomy reveals cycles of planetary motion. Sumerian observers charted the paths of Venus with inexplicable precision. We are not inventing, we are returning. The past calls to us not from imagination but from recognition. We know these truths because they feel familiar. This familiarity suggests something chilling. Humanity may have been here before. Perhaps there was a world, ancient beyond memory, where knowledge soared so high it seemed indistinguishable from magic. Perhaps its downfall was not ignorance, but hubris. Perhaps it reached too far, attempted too much, and collapsed under the weight of its own achievements. A flood, literal or metaphorical, might have swept it away, leaving only fragments that drifted into the emerging cultures of later ages. The Sumerians caught one fragment. Egypt caught another. Others vanished entirely. The ruins of Göbekli Tepe, older than Sumer, tease at this narrative. The pyramids whisper it. The mathematics of ancient India hum it. The myths of the Maya repeat it. Different lands, different tongues, same memory, which leads to the most startling possibility of all. Civilization is not a ladder, but a wheel. It turns, it breaks, it turns again. Each spoke is a society destined to believe it is the first, unaware it rides the rim of something ancient and vast. When the wheel breaks, time does not halt. It resets, and those who rise afterward inherit ruins mistaken for foundations. Sumer's obsession with writing was not vanity, it was fear. They knew what happens when the wheel breaks. They knew that memory is the only force capable of resisting the next collapse. They carved their warnings because they understood that the loss of knowledge is not an accident, it is a pattern. When memory drains away, humanity reverts to instinct. Laws crumble, systems fail, order dissolves. The clay tablets do not ask us to worship the past. They ask us to remember it. They plead with us to see the fragility of knowledge, to understand that intelligence without history is blindness. The flood may not have been a single event. It may be a metaphor for every collapse humanity endures, the washing away of memory until only myth remains. What we call prehistory may be the shadow of a forgotten world, erased not by nature, but by neglect. We stand closer to disaster than we think. Our world hums with data, yet lacks wisdom. We accumulate knowledge faster than we can interpret it. We drown in information while starving for meaning. This imbalance makes us vulnerable to the same cycle that consumed the world before Sumer. Without memory, power becomes dangerous. Without context, knowledge becomes a weapon. If the Sumerians are right, if creation is restoration, then our task is not to invent the future. Our task is to reclaim what was lost. We are not at the summit of intelligence. We are at the foot of a mountain whose peak once touched the stars. And somewhere above us, hidden by time and arrogance, lies the memory of a civilization older than history, wiser than myth, and more advanced than any we can imagine. We have glimpses, we have whispers, we have ruins. We do not yet have remembrance. The notion that humanity has forgotten more than it remembers is not merely poetic melancholy. It may be the central truth buried beneath the world's earliest civilizations. If the Sumerians inherited fragments of a world that came before, then the question that presses upon us is not whether such a world existed, but why it was lost. The idea of a forgotten era, one that reached heights we cannot yet fathom, trembles just beneath the surface of our collective myths, waiting for recognition. It is a ghost that refuses to rest. All ancient cultures, no matter how distant in geography or language, speak of a time when the world was different, when gods walked among men, when knowledge flowed freely, when the line between heaven and earth was not so sharply drawn. Our age is accustomed to metaphor, so we imagine these accounts to be symbolic. Yet symbols are rarely created from nothing. They are reflections, distortions of something that was once real. A myth is not a lie. It is a memory wearing a mask. If we tear away the mask, what remains? Consider the peculiar uniformity of ancient flood myths. From the plains of Mesopotamia to the temples of India, from the mountains of Peru to the islands of Polynesia, the same pattern repeats. A world destroyed, a chosen survivor, instructions to preserve life, and a rebirth of humanity afterward. This is not a local legend. It is a global scar, a shared trauma. Civilizations that supposedly never interacted recorded the same wound in different tongues. Was the flood literal water drowning continents, or was it an allegory for the drowning of knowledge? The idea that water erased a previous world is startling, but less startling than the alternative, that something else did. A catastrophe need not be made of the waves. It can be ignorance, arrogance, war, disease, or a failure to preserve memory. Knowledge is fragile. It demands continuity. Break its chain for a single generation, and everything collapses. Skills vanish. Systems crumble. Concepts that took millennia to polish become unintelligible. Humanity does not need divine wrath to fall. It merely needs to forget. The Sumerians feared forgetting more than death. Death was a passage, but forgetting was annihilation. A man who dies lives on in his name, his deeds, the echoes of his existence. But a civilization that forgets itself has no name. It becomes dust, unknowable, and unremembered. What survived from Sumer did so only because clay endures fire. What survived from what came before may have had no such vessel. Imagine a society so advanced it relied upon materials, methods, or mediums that left no trace. If our own civilization vanished tomorrow, what would remain in 10,000 years? The metal of our cities would rust. The wood would rot. Our plastics would shatter. Our data, the lifeblood of our era, would die instantly without electricity. Our language, if unrecorded, would vanish in a single century. Future archaeologists would find stone foundations, occasional steel remnants, perhaps a few monuments. They might find stories carved into tablets, but without context they would assume we were primitive, unable to imagine what they cannot see. Now turn that thought backwards. What if a past civilization reached a point we cannot comprehend, using materials and knowledge we have not rediscovered? Their monuments might have been erased by water, tectonic shifts, or time. Their devices might have dissolved. Their language may have evaporated. Only the Sumerians' desperate attempt to salvage memory remains, the earliest patch in a long chain of repairs. If humanity exists in cycles, then each cycle is a reconstruction. growing weaker with every repetition unless memory is preserved. Each collapse leaves fewer fragments. Each rebirth begins further from the truth. The Sumerians stepped into the aftermath of one such cycle. Their stories preserve its shadow. The gods who once ruled, the knowledge once whole, the flood that severed the connection. What if the so-called gods were simply survivors of the previous age, individuals who possessed knowledge incomprehensible to those awakening in the next cycle? To beings who had forgotten mathematics, astronomy, and engineering, such survivors would appear divine. Their instructions would be immortalized as commandments. Their tools would be remembered as miracles. Their names would echo as mythology. Human memory is not designed to hold truth indefinitely. It degrades, it embellishes, it simplifies. Over generations, a teacher becomes a spirit, a leader becomes a god, a device becomes a talisman. What was once practical becomes mystical. This is how history transforms into myth, but the myth retains the outline of the truth. Like a skeleton without flesh, it is up to later ages to reconstruct the missing body. The Sumerians attempted this reconstruction. Their cities reflect not experimentation, but replication. Their ziggurats mimic mountains of the gods. They built earthly copies of structures that must have existed in stories older than themselves. Their texts speak of prior ages with such certainty that they clearly did not believe they were imagining them. To the Sumerians, antiquity was not a void. It was a landscape of memory. Consider the extraordinary depth of their astronomical understanding. They tracked cycles that take centuries to reveal themselves. They measured the heavens with tools we do not possess. They aligned their temples with precision we still struggle to replicate. We could dismiss this as coincidence, but coincidence does not explain consistency across millennia. Nor does it explain why the earliest knowledge is the most complete. There is a paradox embedded in history. The older the record, the more advanced the knowledge appears. The closer we move to the present, the more fragmented the understanding becomes. We expect childhood at the beginning and maturity at the end, yet history shows maturity first, followed by gradual amnesia. What we call progress may be no more than rediscovery. If we accept this, a chilling thought emerges. Modern civilization may not be rising, it may be resurfacing. The technologies that define our era, genetics, cosmology, quantum mechanics, mirror ideas hinted at in ancient myths. If myths are code, then we are decoding fragments of a forgotten manual. Even now we experience the strain of memory loss. Our digital world stores everything and remembers nothing. We outsource our minds to machines. We worship novelty while ignoring origins. Information multiplies exponentially, yet wisdom evaporates. We're drowning in knowledge and starving for meaning. This imbalance is the first symptom of collapse. The Sumerians warned of this. They wrote obsessively because they saw written language as the antidote to oblivion. They did not document everyday life merely to record it. They did so because they believed the world needed anchors. Their scribes were not chroniclers. They were guardians stationed at the mouth of memory's grave. But clay alone cannot save humanity. Clay preserves words, not understanding. Meaning decays even when text survives. A tablet without context is a corpse. We must ask, are we any closer to understanding the mind of Sumer than the Babylonians were? Or are we another link in the chain of forgetting? If civilization cycles, then the past is not behind us. It is beneath us. The earth is a palimpsest of worlds layered upon one another. Cities rest atop older cities. Languages hide inside languages. Every myth is a fossil. One day, perhaps, we will uncover enough fragments to reconstruct the whole. Or perhaps, like those before us, we will fail. The choice is not destiny. It is memory. If we forget, we will fall. If we remember, we may rise higher than any age before us. The Sumerians were not the beginning. They were a reminder, not a dawn, but a wake-up call. Not the first voice, but the last echo of something vast and magnificent. And echoes, if ignored, fade into silence. There is a peculiar arrogance in the modern world, a confidence so deeply ingrained that we rarely notice it. We assume that history is a straight line, that time moves from primitive ignorance toward inevitable enlightenment, that we are the most advanced generation to ever walk the earth. Every technological breakthrough, every scientific discovery, every new machine reinforces this belief. Yet beneath this self-assured veneer lies a truth we are reluctant to entertain. We may not be the apex of human achievement, but merely the latest iteration in a long sequence of forgotten worlds. If knowledge can be inherited, it can also be misplaced. If civilizations can rise, they can also fall, and if something existed before us, something remarkable, its absence would not mean it never was, only that we have forgotten how to recognize its remnants. The Sumerians were closer to this forgotten world than we are. They stood in the twilight between memory and oblivion. Their culture bore the weight of remembering while already feeling memory slip away. The stories they left behind reveal a world haunted by loss. Their gods are not omnipotent beings, but administrators of a legacy they themselves do not fully control. They carry burdens, quarrel over responsibilities, and struggle with the consequences of human existence. This is not the behavior of creators, it is the behavior of inheritors, of caretakers managing something they did not build. Their myths do not describe an age of divine genesis. They describe a world recovering from a rupture. This rupture, whether flood or forgetfulness, marks a fracture in time. Something came before it, something whose echoes ripple across mythologies like fragments of a shattered mirror. Every shard reflects a different angle, yet all point toward the same unseen form. Ancient India speaks of yugas, vast cycles of time in which civilizations rise and fall. Egypt recalls the Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden era when gods dwelled upon the earth. Greece remembers the ages of man, gold, silver, bronze, iron, each age worse than the last. The Maya describes suns that ended in catastrophe. Every ancient culture shares this melancholy certainty. The world was once greater than it is now. If that is true, then the human story is not a ladder climbing upward. It is a spiral, returning again and again to the same point. Each cycle begins with fragments of inherited knowledge, misunderstood and gradually lost. Civilizations mistake these fragments for innovations and take pride in rebuilding what was once complete. Our achievements become rediscoveries. Our discoveries become repetitions. Consider architecture. The oldest megalithic structures on Earth defy simple explanation. They appear at the beginning of archaeological time, not the end. Göbekli Tepe, built long before agriculture was supposedly invented, displays symbolic sophistication and engineering beyond tribes of hunter-gatherers. The Egyptian pyramids, millions of tons of precisely cut stone aligned to celestial points, emerge not at the peak of Egyptian civilization, but near its dawn. The builders of Stonehenge, Puma Punku, and other ancient sites left behind precision we struggle to replicate. How does mastery appear where there should be experimentation? Why do the earliest monuments look like the work of experienced engineers? The simplest answer is also the most unsettling. The builders were not beginning. They were remembering. Their designs were not inventions, but echoes. Their monuments were not first attempts, but memorials to a system they no longer fully understood. If the knowledge that inspired them descended from an earlier age, it would explain why the oldest structures are the most enigmatic, why they appear without precedent, without prototypes, without evolution. Technology follows the same pattern. Sumerian mathematics was sophisticated from its inception. Their lunar calendar was more accurate than calendars created thousands of years later. Their medical practices show awareness of anatomy and pharmacology that required generations of learning. Their astronomical records track celestial cycles spanning centuries. None of these show signs of trial and error development. They appear already polished. We assume that ancient thinkers were limited by their tools, yet tools are the visible expression of knowledge, not its origin. A scientist can lose her laboratory, but not her understanding of chemistry. A mathematician can be stripped of pen and paper, yet retain numbers in the mind. If a catastrophe ruptured a highly advanced world, knowledge would survive in memory long after its machines were gone. The next civilization would carry the shadows of that knowledge, reassembling fragments into systems it only partially comprehends. This hypothesis redefines mythic figures. The Anunnaki cease to be deities and become remnants of a prior age, survivors carrying knowledge too vast for the next world to absorb. Their symbols become misunderstood, their roles distort, their faces dissolve into carved stone. In time, they become gods not because they were immortal, but because memory failed. Human beings have always mistaken understanding for origin. We assume that because we know something now, we must have discovered it. But our knowledge may be the residue of something greater. Intelligence is not proof of invention. A child reciting multiplication tables does not invent mathematics. Humanity reciting cosmic truths may not have created them. We live in a world terrified of the unknown and intoxicated by certainty. Modern science dismisses ancient testimony as superstition without considering that superstition might be decayed knowledge. Religion assumes myth represents divine instruction rather than broken history. Both miss the possibility that myth is a survival mechanism, memory coded into story because words alone could not endure. If myth is memory, then we must confront a possibility that changes everything. Our ancestors were not primitive. They were post-apocalyptic. Their world was not the beginning. It was the recovery. The Sumerians did not invent civilization. They resurrected it. Our schools teach that civilization rose from ignorance, but ignorance does not produce astronomy, medicine, architecture, city planning, and complex language spontaneously. Ignorance does not create clocks or calendars. Ignorance does not align temples with solstices. Ignorance does not write poetry about the movement of Venus. Something else must have existed before the first cities, something capable of shaping humanity long before memory dissolved. And the process of dissolving is still happening. Look around our world today. Information multiplies, yet understanding shrinks. Technology accelerates, yet wisdom lags. Our systems become more complex while our minds become more fragmented. We outsource memory to devices. We treat history as irrelevant. We reduce tradition to entertainment. Once a society divorces itself from memory, collapse becomes inevitable. Not because enemies conquer it, but because identity dissolves. A house without foundation cannot stand. The Sumerians left clay tablets because they understood this truth. They tried to hold back the tide of forgetting, not knowing whether anyone in the future would understand. Their desperation was not paranoia, it was prophecy. We now find ourselves at a crossroads similar to theirs. We hold immense power without context. We discover without knowing what we are remembering. We build without knowing what we are rebuilding. And the cycle waits patiently, ready to turn again. The question is no longer whether a forgotten world existed. The question is whether we will join it. Will we preserve our memory, or will we become myth? Will our skyscrapers be ruins, our languages fossils, our knowledge dust? Will future generations uncover fragments of our world and wonder, as we wonder about Sumer, how such sophistication appeared with no origin? The wheel turns, it always has, and the Sumerians standing at the brink of remembrance tried to tell us the truth. We are not the beginning. We are the interval. The world before us fell. The world after us will arise. Whether we remain part of that story depends on whether we choose to remember, or allow history to dissolve again into silence. Humanity tends to believe that knowledge advances like an arrow shot across time, straight, uninterrupted, forever moving forward. Yet the deeper we examine the archaeological and mythological record, the clearer it becomes that knowledge behaves less like an arrow and more like a pendulum. It swings outward, accumulates brilliance, touches heights incomprehensible to later ages, then swings back again, scattering fragments as civilizations falter. The Sumerians stood at a point where the pendulum had just returned from one such arc. They did not marvel at their accomplishments. They mourned what had already been lost. Their writings possess a tone of longing not found in the literature of later ages. They do not celebrate creation. They remember a destruction. They do not marvel at discovery. They reassemble broken pieces. This tone permeates their myths, their mathematics, their laws, even their architecture. Their entire civilization seems built on the assumption that the world had once been complete and was now diminished. Every temple erected, every ritual performed, every tablet inscribed feels like a desperate attempt to hold on to something that kept slipping away. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the Sumerian understanding of time. Modern societies see time as linear, fragmented into years, months, days, and seconds, each unit isolated and measurable. But the Sumerians perceived time as cyclical, repeating patterns of cosmic significance. They traced ages, not eras, cycles, not sequences. To them, history was neither random nor progressive. It was predictable, a rotation of ages rising and falling under celestial influence. Their calendars were not simply methods of marking days. They were maps of the cosmos revealing when worlds would shift, when rulers would rise, and when memory itself would begin to erode. Their priests did not watch the skies for curiosity's sake. They observed the heavens with the precision of scientists retrieving old data. They believed that the stars recorded patterns of past worlds, and by reading them, humanity could avoid repeating the catastrophes that ended earlier ages. Their myths of floods, fires, and cosmic resets were warnings, not fantasies. They understood that civilizations do not collapse because they lack knowledge. They collapse because they lose the meaning of knowledge. To modern ears, this may sound romantic or symbolic, yet evidence from archaeology paints the same unsettling picture. Civilizations appear abruptly, complete with agriculture, astronomy, social structure, and religious cosmology. Their subsequent development shows refinement but not invention. This suggests that humanity did not invent civilization. It remembered it. We inherit truths we do not fully grasp, then pretend we created them. It is tempting to dismiss the idea of forgotten worlds or collapsed cycles as escapist speculation. But consider this. Every surviving myth from every surviving culture tells us the same thing. What is remarkable is not that different societies imagined similar stories, but that these stories align so precisely. They describe ages of greatness, sudden catastrophe, attempts at preservation, and the rebuilding of civilization by survivors who carry fragments of knowledge. If these were merely imaginative inventions, why do cultures separated by oceans share the same narrative structure? Sumer teaches that myth is not metaphor. Myth is memory, encoded in a language that survives catastrophe. When technology fails, when cities fall, when writing disappears, myth persists because myth does not require tools. It requires only voice. The Sumerians knew this. They knew that if the world ended again, language would fracture, scripts would be lost, and clay would crumble. But myth would remain, passed from mouth to ear, age after age, until someone somewhere recognized its meaning. That someone might be us. Our world is experiencing a crisis of memory analogous to the one that haunted ancient Sumer. We are surrounded by more information than any civilization before us, yet we understand less. We know how to manipulate matter, but not why it matters. We explore the cosmos, yet remain confused by our origins. Our myths are now movies. Our priests are scientists. Our temples are digital networks. Yet beneath the noise lies the same truth the Sumerians feared. Knowledge without memory is chaos. The Sumerians were terrified of chaos, not in the sense of violence or disorder, but in the metaphysical sense. Chaos as the breakdown of meaning. Their word for chaos referred not to conflict, but forgetfulness. When the me, the foundational principles of existence, are lost, the world does not end in flames. It ends in confusion. Structures collapse not because walls fall, but because minds empty. We see shadows of this in our own age. Our calendars no longer track cycles of meaning, only appointments. Our measurements no longer speak to cosmic order, only utility. Our languages lose depth, our histories become entertainment, and our myths become fantasy. The tools of memory exist, but the purpose dissolves. What happens when a civilization forgets why it invented writing? What happens when knowledge becomes trivia? The Sumerians anticipated this question. Their stories reveal that the gods did not fear human achievement. They feared human forgetfulness. Humanity could surpass gods in strength or ingenuity, but if humanity forgot the core laws, what we call the me, it would destroy itself. For the Sumerians, civilization was not a product of intelligence, but of remembrance. To forget was to fall. This insight transforms the ancient flood narrative. The flood becomes more than a physical deluge. It becomes the symbol of memory's erasure, the drowning of knowledge so complete that the next world starts from scratch. The flood is not water, it is time, and time, left unchecked, washes away meaning as relentlessly as waves wear down stone. The Sumerians sensed that another flood would always come. They did not know when, but they knew it was inevitable because memory is fragile. Their libraries were lifeboats, carrying knowledge across the ocean of oblivion. Their tablets were oars, their scripts were sails, their myths the stars by which future sailors might navigate. When we rediscovered their cities, we did not recover their world. We found only the faint outlines of a worldview too vast for our fragmented age to absorb. We saw gods and assumed superstition. We saw cycles and assumed ignorance. We saw warnings and assumed fantasy. We saw memory and called it myth. This is not progress. It is blindness. If the Sumerians were right, our world stands on the edge of another cycle. We possess unprecedented power, yet lack the anchor of meaning that guides it. Our tools expand while our understanding shrinks. Our networks grow while our wisdom recedes. We advance technologically yet regress spiritually. Our brilliance may be the final flare before darkness. But cycles are not punishments, they are opportunities. If humanity stands at the brink of forgetting, it also stands at the brink of remembering. The fragments of the past, our myths, our ruins, our languages, can serve as bridges to a forgotten truth. The Sumerians left not answers but signs, symbols, structures, numbers, and narratives that point toward a world before memory's flood. The greatest question of our age is not whether ancient civilizations were more advanced than we assumed. It is whether we are capable of learning from their warnings before our own memory erodes. The world before Sumer fell. Sumer inherited its ashes. We inherited theirs. The cycle has turned many times. It will turn again. Whether we rise higher or fall further depends not on intelligence but on remembrance. The future belongs not to those who know the most, but to those who remember why knowledge matters. The Sumerians did not speak to their past. They spoke to us. Their language has crossed millennia, not because they sought immortality, but because they feared extinction. Their message is simple, yet few understand it. The world ends when we forget, and it begins again when we remember. The deeper one studies the remnants of ancient civilizations, the more unsettling the truth becomes. What we call history may not be a chronological ascent from ignorance to enlightenment, but the flickering residue of something far older, a memory deteriorating through time. The Sumerians left behind more than artifacts. They left behind a worldview in which humanity does not advance but remembers, does not innovate but reconstructs. Their culture was not born out of chaos but out of recollection. They spoke not with the pride of originators but with the fatigue of survivors. To understand the depth of their message, one must imagine the world through their eyes. They did not look backward and see emptiness. They looked backward and saw greatness, an age before time collapsed, before the flood reshaped existence, before memory fractured. Their stories do not begin with the rise of humanity. They begin with the decline of something that came before. This sense of decline is not nostalgic melancholy, it is certainty. It is knowledge that the present is a fragment of a shattered whole. This worldview manifests in the very structure of their myths. The Anunnaki are not omnipresent creators. They are rulers who arrive, assign tasks, distribute the me, and then depart. Such narratives do not describe gods emerging from primordial chaos, but beings entering a world already in motion. Their arrival implies displacement. Someone else must have been here first. The Sumerians never mention humans inventing anything fundamental. Writing, agriculture, kingship. Each descends from the heavens like relics from an earlier age. The Sumerians do not create civilization. They inherit it. If this is true, then the Sumerians stand at the midpoint of a story that stretches far beyond the boundaries of recorded time. They exist not at the dawn of human thought, but at the twilight of an older epoch. Their brilliance is not the spark of a beginning, it is the afterglow of a world whose flame has already diminished. This perspective challenges everything the modern age believes about itself. We imagine ourselves as explorers reaching new heights of understanding, yet the foundations of our knowledge rest upon structures we did not build. Our mathematics descends from Sumerian numbers. Our calendars derive from ancient cosmic cycles. Our languages carry grammatical and conceptual fossils of lost world views. Our myths echo tragedies we do not remember. We stand atop a pyramid of forgotten ages, unaware that the peak we celebrate may be only the exposed tip of something far more immense. The archaeological record only deepens the mystery. Beneath cities lie older cities. Beneath those lie ruins older still. And beneath those, perhaps, lie the remains of a world we cannot yet imagine. Every excavation feels like peeling away layers of sleep. With each layer removed, humanity wakes to the possibility that it is far older than it knows and far younger than it believes. Our arrogance blinds us to this truth. We think we are the first to harness technology, yet the world is littered with signs that earlier civilizations may have done the same, only in forms we do not recognize. If a prior age used materials that did not survive time, then the absence of their artifacts proves nothing. We find stone because stone endures. We find clay because clay hardens in fire. We assume ancient people built in stone because that is all that remains. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Perhaps earlier ages built with substances we cannot detect, engineered devices that dissolved, or recorded information on mediums that could not withstand catastrophe. If so, then the Sumerians were correct. Memory is more fragile than stone. Even now, we see how quickly memory can collapse. A single generation without education can lose language. A century of turmoil can erase entire cultures. Books burn, data corrupts, knowledge disappears. We comfort ourselves with the illusion of permanence because our buildings are tall and our servers hum with information. But without context, data becomes noise. Without understanding, information dies. The Sumerians did not fear invasion. They feared oblivion. They watched knowledge fade even as they wrote it down. They saw how rituals became gestures without meaning. They saw how numbers became symbols without reference. They saw how kingship, once a cosmic duty, became a human ambition. They witnessed the slow corrosion of purpose, a corrosion that begins not with destruction, but with misunderstanding. This misunderstanding still haunts us. When we examine ancient myths, we dismiss them as superstition instead of encoded history. We assume ancient texts are attempts to explain nature, rather than attempts to preserve truths. We mock ancient cosmology because it does not resemble ours, forgetting that our cosmology will one day appear just as naive. Knowledge ages not because it is false, but because memory shifts. To understand the world before Sumer, we must first understand ourselves. Humanity is addicted to the idea of progress. We believe we climb when perhaps we circle. We think of time as a ladder, yet ladders can break. Cycles do not. The Sumerians perceived time as a wheel because they lived close enough to hear its turning. They remembered a world before theirs and sensed a world after theirs. Their myths portray history not as a line, but as a spiral. If civilization spirals, then meaning erodes at each turn. The first age remembers everything. The second remembers fragments. The third mistakes fragments for inventions. The fourth forgets entirely. We may be entering the fourth. Our technologies are extraordinary, yet our understanding of them grows shallow. We invent machines without knowing how to live. We expand communication while losing language. We discover cosmic phenomena yet forget why we search. We accumulate facts while starving for truth. We do not lack intelligence. We lack connection to origins. What begins as memory becomes habit. What begins as truth becomes metaphor. What begins as structure becomes superstition. When structure collapses, all that remains are ruins and myths. The Sumerians tried to prevent this collapse. Their temples aligned with stars to preserve cosmic order. Their laws encoded cosmic balance. Their myths taught the purpose of existence. Their writing fixed memory in clay. But clay cannot preserve the living mind. Clay preserves only bones. Without breath, bones tell nothing. The question is not whether Sumer fell. All civilizations fall. The question is whether we will fall as they did, not because of war or fire, but because of forgetting. Forgetting is the only true catastrophe. Fire can be rebuilt, stone can be quarried, rivers can be redirected. But once meaning dissolves, nothing can bring it back. We stand at a strange moment in history. We possess more information than any people who came before us, yet less wisdom. We know how to split atoms, yet do not know how to keep peace. We can reach the stars, yet cannot answer the questions whispered by the earth beneath our feet. We look forward, terrified of what we might become, yet never consider what we might already have been. The Sumerians tried to leave us a message. It was simple, urgent, and clear. Remember. Remember, or you will rebuild the world blind. Remember, or the cycle will begin again. Remember, for the greatest loss is not death. It is the death of memory. And when memory dies, history resets. Civilizations vanish. Truth becomes myth. Myth becomes rumor. Rumor becomes silence. And silence waits for another Sumer to rise from the dust and begin the cycle once more. Humanity exists in a strange tension between certainty and ignorance. We build monuments to our achievements, yet beneath every stone lies a question we cannot answer. We map the heavens and dissect atoms, but we still do not know who we are, where we truly came from, or how many worlds lived and died before our own. The Sumerians confronted this tension directly. They did not claim to understand everything, but they understood one thing better than we do. Memory is the root of civilization. Strip memory away, and the tallest tower will crumble from the inside out. Preserve memory, and even ruins can one day grow into greatness. The heart of the Sumerian worldview beats with this single truth. Everything they built, every temple, every tablet, every law, was an attempt to anchor knowledge against the tides of time. To them, knowledge was not progressive, it was regressive. It flowed downward from an earlier world. It passed like an inheritance, not from child to parent, but from gods to men. And if men failed to guard it, the inheritance would decay, leaving nothing but fragments. What kind of world must have existed to leave such an inheritance behind? We are accustomed to imagining early humanity as primitive, living in caves, grunting at lightning, terrified of nature. But perhaps the cave was not the beginning. Perhaps it was the refuge of survivors. Perhaps the earliest humans were not inventors, but refugees from a world whose brilliance was already fading. Imagine escaping the collapse of a civilization so advanced that the memory of it would haunt every culture that emerged afterward. Imagine possessing knowledge you could not use because the tools to wield it no longer existed. That is not progress. That is regression masked as invention. We see traces of this regression everywhere. Knowledge appears abruptly at the dawn of history, as if carried from somewhere else. Agriculture does not slowly evolve. It emerges full-formed. Writing does not begin as pictures. It begins as administration. Cities do not grow from huts. They erupt as complex systems with social hierarchies, religious rituals, and astronomical observations. It is as if humanity inherited a blueprint and then spent millennia relearning how to read it. What we call the rise of civilization may have been the slow process of decoding a manual left behind by a world we can no longer recall. This raises a question so uncomfortable that most historians refuse to consider it. What if civilization did not begin in Sumer, but restarted there? What if the first cities of Mesopotamia were built not by pioneers, but by descendants of survivors who remembered just enough to reconstruct a fraction of what once was? Their myths, when read without prejudice, do not describe beginnings. They describe repairs. They describe gods returning, distributing functions, re-establishing laws. They describe memory being restored piece by piece, as if someone were rebuilding a shattered machine whose original shape had been lost. This idea becomes even more compelling when we consider the Sumerian obsession with kingship. Kingship is not portrayed as a political invention. It is something that descends from heaven, suggesting it was a structure known before humans existed. A king was not a ruler, but a conduit. He linked the earthly world to the cosmic order. Remove the king, and the link was broken, plunging society into chaos. This is not myth. It is memory of a time when governance was a science, not a struggle for power, a science that was lost and imperfectly resurrected. Our modern understanding of leadership is a diluted echo of this. We choose leaders through conflict, persuasion, or inheritance. The Sumerians saw leadership as a function, like gravity, embedded into the fabric of existence. Their kings were reflections of something divine, not because they wielded power, but because they bore responsibility. They were not creators of order. They were guardians of memory. Their failures were not political. They were cosmic. Consider how differently we view rulers today. Our leaders administer nations without understanding the foundations of civilization. They govern without memory. They legislate without context. They inherit power without inheriting wisdom. Power unanchored to memory becomes destruction, because without the past, the future has no direction. The Sumerians feared this more than anything. Their myths are filled with warnings about leaders who forget their origin, who mistake authority for ownership, who try to change laws they were meant only to uphold. To forget the me, those primordial principles, was to invite collapse. Collapse in the Sumerian worldview was not an accident. It was a recurring event. Worlds do not break from outside forces. They implode when memory decays. When the core purpose of civilization becomes unclear, societies begin to drift. Rituals lose meaning. Laws lose legitimacy. Technology loses purpose. The Sumerians believed this decay occurred not because humans were weak or evil, but because memory is mortal. No matter how brilliant a world becomes, it will fall unless its memory is protected. We see this pattern in our age. We have machines that can perform calculations once reserved for gods. We can split atoms, map genomes, and manipulate life. Yet we use these powers with no clear understanding of their moral weight. Our innovation has outpaced our ability to remember why innovation matters. The Sumerians would recognize this moment instantly. They would see it as the precursor to collapse, an age where knowledge expands faster than meaning. When knowledge loses meaning, chaos becomes inevitable. At the height of their civilization, the Sumerians sensed this chaos creeping toward them. Their stories grew more anxious, their rituals grew more performative, their architectural precision waned, they wrote more and understood less. They could still repeat the patterns, but they could no longer decode their purpose. They were like children reciting prayers in a language they had forgotten. When memory dies, repetition replaces thought. Our age mirrors this stage with chilling clarity. We cling to ideas we barely understand. We recite rights and freedoms without recalling why they were forged. We mimic democracy without grasping its roots. We speak of progress without defining its goal. We worship data and ignore wisdom. We have information but lack orientation. We are repeating Sumer's final act. The question is not whether our civilization will fall. All civilizations fall. The question is whether we will fall blind. The Sumerians fell with their eyes open. They foresaw their end. They carved warnings into clay. They tried to pass on memory. But somewhere along the line, someone stopped listening. Someone mistook memory for myth. We are at the same crossroads now. The warnings have been delivered, not in clay tablets this time, but in scientific reports, philosophical arguments, and cultural breakdowns. We live in a world so saturated with signals that we mistake noise for meaning. Our greatest danger is not ignorance, it is forgetfulness. Ignorance can be cured by knowledge. Forgetfulness can only be cured by remembrance, and remembrance requires humility. Humility is the key the Sumerians tried to teach. It is the acknowledgement that we are not originators, but inheritors. We did not build civilization from nothing. We inherited a structure that we barely understand. We have renovated its rooms but forgotten its foundation. Without humility, we believe our knowledge is creation, not recollection. We believe we are gods, not custodians, and once we believe we are gods, we destroy what we were meant to preserve. This may be why Sumerian myths portray the gods as flawed. They were not perfect beings, but reminders that power without memory leads to ruin. Their errors were warnings, not stories. Their defeats were lessons. Their flood was not punishment. It was consequence. Consequence for forgetting, for hubris, for mistaking inheritance for invention. We are tempted to look at ancient people and laugh at their simplicity. Yet perhaps they look at us from across time and grieve at our blindness. They tried to warn us that civilization is not something built once. It is something rebuilt endlessly. And every rebuilding begins with memory. Without memory, we loop endlessly, mistaking repetition for progress. The Sumerians could not stop their own end, but they believed someone, someday, might understand. They believed memory could survive long enough for another world to rebuild meaning. Their faith was not in gods, but in the future, in us. The question that remains is not historical, it is existential. Will we remember, or will we forget? Memory is a fragile flame. If we let it flicker, darkness returns. If we protect it, the world may rise higher than it ever has. The Sumerians held the flame for as long as they could. Now it burns in our hands. The end of a civilization rarely resembles a grand finale. It does not arrive with blazing comets, roaring armies, or thunder that splits the sky. Most endings begin with something far less dramatic, a quiet shift in meaning, a soft erosion of purpose, a subtle fading of memory so gentle that no one recognizes it as the first step toward oblivion. The Sumerians understood this with a clarity that feels almost prophetic. They knew that buildings do not collapse when their stones weaken, but when the minds that built them forget why the structure mattered in the first place. They knew that history does not die when a people fall, but when their stories turn into empty syllables, repeated by mouths that have forgotten their soul. For the Sumerians, memory was not an accessory to life. It was its very foundation. A person could lose wealth, land, power, even a kingdom, and recover, as long as memory remained intact. But once memory faltered, everything else followed it into fragmentation. They watched as this process began to unfold around them. They saw how rituals, once infused with cosmic significance, became hollow performances. They noticed how the meaning behind symbols drained away until only symbols remained. They sensed that their world was not ending in violence or famine or catastrophe, but in amnesia. And in that recognition lies the most haunting truth they have left behind. Modern societies seldom consider memory a resource. We hoard information but misplace meaning. We preserve data yet abandon understanding. We believe that storing knowledge in machines is the same as remembering it. The Sumerians would have seen this as the beginning of decay. To them, knowledge that is not lived, not internalized, not rooted in identity, is already halfway dead. A library without readers is a graveyard. A digital archive without comprehension is a mausoleum of numbers. A civilization that relies on external memory is a body that has forgotten how to breathe. Imagine for a moment an ancient people watching their world transform. They still recite their myths, but no longer comprehend their truths. Their priests still track the stars, but no longer know why the sky matters. Their kings still sit upon thrones, but no longer understand what kingship demands. They still speak the words that once upheld the cosmos, but the meaning behind those words has turned to dust. This is how civilizations fall, not when enemies breach the gates, but when memory slips quietly from the mind. The Sumerians saw their own descent into forgetfulness. Their stories began to lose the weight of revelation and turned into tales. Their inscriptions slowly became puzzles even for themselves. Their knowledge had been inherited rather than invented, and inheritance without comprehension is a burden too heavy to carry across time. They understood the tragic irony that a civilization can preserve the shape of knowledge long after losing its substance. It is possible to remember the words of a song but forget the language in which it was written. That is the danger we now face. We believe ourselves enlightened because we command electricity, engines, algorithms, and rockets. Yet we struggle to explain why we build these things, or what purpose lies behind our acceleration. We move faster, but we do not know where we're going. We think more, but we understand less. Our knowledge grows like a tree without roots, impressive in height, but unstable, ready to topple the moment a strong wind arrives. In such a world, progress can become indistinguishable from collapse. Tools intended to enhance life become instruments of distraction. Systems designed to preserve truth become mechanisms of confusion. The Sumerians would call this the final phase before forgetting consumes a civilization entirely. They witnessed this stage in their own time and tried desperately to leave markers, clues, warnings, anything that might survive the coming silence. Their clay tablets are not proud monuments of their knowledge. They are lifeboats set adrift on the sea of time. Each one whispers the same message. Knowledge is nothing if its purpose is lost. They did not write to boast. They wrote to remind. They did not fear war or famine. They feared that nobody in the future would remember why humans learned to count, why temples were aligned to the heavens, why law was tied to cosmic order, why rulers were more than political figures but caretakers of the world's balance. To the Sumerians, civilization was not a human achievement. It was a fragile agreement between memory and order. Once memory breaks, order dissolves. Once order dissolves, the world collapses into chaos. Not chaos as violence, but chaos as meaninglessness. There is no catastrophe more absolute than a society that wakes up one day unable to understand the tools it possesses. We like to imagine that ancient people were afraid of storms or beasts or darkness. In truth, they were afraid of forgetting. They feared a world where the laws of existence had survived, but the reason behind those laws had disappeared. They feared becoming shadows of their ancestors, repeating gestures they no longer understood, worshipping forms whose souls had evaporated. Their fear was justified. Their world did not collapse because they were conquered. It collapsed because the memory that held it together thinned until it tore. Modern humanity stands now where Sumer once stood. We have inherited mechanisms, symbols, systems, and freedoms, forged by minds we have never met. We invoke values without knowing who paid their price. We repeat phrases whose origins we cannot trace. We manipulate forces, from nuclear power to genetic code, without the wisdom that once guided those who first learned to observe nature. In a world overflowing with knowledge, we may be drifting into the same ocean of forgetting that swallowed countless worlds before ours. But within this danger lies an opportunity the Sumerians never had. We possess fragments of their message and fragments of messages before them. We have uncovered ruins, deciphered tablets, translated myths, and reassembled puzzles that whisper the same refrain across millennia. Humanity does not progress by invention alone. Humanity progresses by remembering. Memory is not nostalgia. Memory is direction. It is the compass that reveals whether we are building upon foundations or constructing monuments to vanity. Without memory, every generation becomes an orphan. With memory, every generation becomes an heir. We can either inherit a past and continue its work or ignore it and repeat it blindly. The Sumerians left us more than history. They left us a choice. We can treat their stories as quaint fictions from a primitive age, or we can recognize them as warnings written by people who stood at the very edge of forgetting. They knew what we are only beginning to grasp. Civilizations do not fall when enemies attack. They fall when memory weakens. They fall when the thread that binds meaning to existence becomes so thin that it snaps. If there is one truth that unites every ancient myth, every lost civilization, every ruined monument, it is this. The past does not disappear. It waits. It waits for minds capable of remembering. It waits for eyes willing to see patterns, for ears willing to hear echoes. It waits for the moment when a civilization recognizes that the future is built not by those who know the most, but by those who remember the deepest. Perhaps this is why the ruins of Sumer still speak. Not with their stones or their statues, but with their silence. Silence that asks a single question, one that now rests in our hands. Will you remember, or will you forget? For if we forget, we will awaken one day in a world full of tools we cannot use, words we cannot interpret, laws we cannot explain, and powers we cannot control. We will become the next layer of ruins upon which another world will rise, convinced once more that it is the first. But if we choose to remember, truly remember, not merely facts but purpose, not merely stories but meaning, then the cycle need not repeat. Memory can lift humanity beyond the wheel of ascent and collapse. The Sumerians could not halt the turning, but they could point to its rhythm. We can either ignore that rhythm or move in harmony with it. The silence beneath their tablets is not emptiness, it is invitation. It asks whether we will continue as echoes of forgotten ages, or become the first civilization to break the pattern. The choice is ours, and no power in heaven or earth can make it for us. Civilizations die when they forget. They transcend when they remember. The Sumerians knew this truth, preserved it in clay, and placed it gently at our feet. What we do with it will determine not just our future, but whether the memory of humanity becomes a story told by others, or a legacy carried into the ages yet to come.